All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
All right. Now we're 2 weeks into the Iran war right now. And what are the biggest developments right now? I saw word about an aircraft carrier potentially getting hit, KC-135 Stratotanker going down.
Yeah,
How's it
the
looking?
the aircraft carrier. There's rumors of that. No confirmation. Um, the As for the tankers, one of them did go down, and in fact, there have been, I think, at least 4 confirmed deaths as a result of that. And I think there may have been a crew of 6, so we may end up with 6. Um, the Americans say that there was some accident in the air, and it seems that these 2 tankers collided somewhere over Iraq. One of them went down. One of them made an emergency landing at Ben Gurion Airport. And there have been photos that have appeared, on the internet showing a tanker there at Ben Gurion with missing a part of its tail. So anyway, you know, that suggests to me it's probably a collision. If the second tanker had been hit, if actually it was under fire, you would see a different kind of damage, I would think. I'm no expert when it comes to this. I know that the Iranians and the Shia militia in Iraq are saying they shot it down. But they may be claiming something, or maybe they thought they shot it down. I don't know. Maybe they did. But I suspect it was a collision. I'll just say that the evidence that I've seen so far is that it was a collision, and it's certainly believable something like that could happen with all these tankers and other planes flying across Iraqi airspace.
Yeah, I heard Larry Johnson say that it was shot down, but yeah, it's hard to know. It's in the fog
Yeah,
of war. But he also said that many of these KC-135s have been destroyed on the ground. I guess they're not enough hardened bunkers to hide these huge things in them at the Al Udeid Air Base. They've been struck. I don't know I don't think he said exactly where it was. He said, I think he said it
right.
wasn't like privy. I think he was, but he says that many of them have been taken out. So we're only 2 weeks into this war. And if that's true, I'm just wondering how much capacity has been degraded on the U.S. Israeli side to wage this war. We know defensively it's been degraded significantly.
Yeah. Um, right. Again, about the tankers at the air bases. Yes, certainly. I think a lot of those are vulnerable, or even if they're in hangars, again, the Iranians have been striking the hangars. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were a number of aircraft that have been struck on the ground at the various air bases around the Persian Gulf. Um, yeah, but how much has Israeli and U.S. Their military capabilities been degraded? I think if you're looking at damage actually inflicted by Iran, well, you look at the air bases. There has been a significant degradation. There's no question about it. They have taken out the radars, and that really does make things more difficult, for Israel and for the U.S. They and they've, possibly tankers and other military infrastructures. There's no question about it. But I think that if you're, maybe the larger issue is just the question of the stockpiles. That I think all in all, U.S. and Israel, they still have a tremendous number of aircraft and means to deliver lethal munitions to Iran, but they are running out of those munitions. There was a report, I think it was in the Financial Times, that said that U.S. officials were becoming alarmed by the depletion of munitions, and particularly 3. They pointed to the Patriot interceptors, the THAAD interceptors, and Tomahawk missiles. That's an offensive weapon. And when they run out of those, I guess that's in the not so distant future. They will be weakened as a result. So I think that's the most significant development as far as military capabilities go.
Yeah, there's so much talk about interceptors, the Patriot and the THAAD. But to me, it just, I don't even think that's the problem. These things are way too expensive. And they're not that effective, and they rely, on these radars that have been taken out, and that's why, from my understanding, Israel and the United States have been having to expend like 7, 8 interceptors to try to take down one ballistic missile because the cross radar section's all messed up because they don't have this layered
Right.
radar network anymore, and so they're just firing their whole salvo, and they're still missing. So, like, what's
Yeah,
the
no,
point of these interceptors? It's just that you can't. You have to just go all offense. I mean,
right.
the only country that has air defense that seems to really work is Russia. Russia's the only country that seems to have really built up a huge network, and we've seen it. Even then, like there was a missile attack in Bryansk. I think some storm shadows broke through,
Right.
but in general, we've seen them take out HIMARS, ATACMS. They seem to be
And storm shadows, right. In
and storm
general.
shadows.
Right.
Basically everything they've been able to
Yeah.
neutralize.
There's
pretty
never
effectively.
100%, but it seems like it's well over 50% for the Russians, because you'll hear about 7 missiles going in and they take down 5 or 6 of them. That's typical, maybe even better. And with the drones, it's very close to 100%. It's not quite, remember that one time that the drones were sent at, the Valdai residence of President Putin. It was over 90 drones, and they shot down or disabled them with electronic warfare. All of them, every last one of them. So yeah, it does show that they have remarkable air defense system. But the Patriot is just not that good. I mean, this is something that Ted Postal, he claims that it's like they just get lucky sometimes. That it's something on the order of 5%. I'm not sure what. Maybe again, we're talking about good, let's say supersonic or ballistic missiles. We won't even talk about hypersonic, but just supersonic ballistic missiles. It just has a very, very low intercept rate, and that's with that early warning radar working, because that's very, very important part of the system. They had that one out in Qatar, and it could detect the missiles immediately after launch. It could predict its trajectory. It could transfer that information to, let's say, to the Israelis, who would know that it was, expect this missile to be coming in at a certain point in the sky, and then they could focus their own radars on that and be ready for it. But even with that, they had a very low intercept rate, again, according to Ted Postal. And it just has to be much lower now, because now they're, when a missile is coming in without that early warning, they can make a kind of a wild guess, but they have to look at a large section of the sky, and it's just make guesses, is it there? Is it there? And then all of a sudden, damn, you see it too late and it blows up, a mile from you or something, and the truth is, again, I haven't done the statistical analysis that he's done, but I have seen a lot of these videos, and you can see in some cases, it's not just, they'll say 2 or 3 interceptors, but there will be, up to a dozen interceptors, and it will still get through. I've seen videos like that, that's
Right.
So you wonder, why are they so desperate to get interceptors? Why is this such a big issue if it really isn't effective? I don't really understand. It's the Ted Postal says there's a real corruption, and these Raytheon that makes like the Patriot systems has gone to great lengths to really fabricate their success rate. And it's just sort of everybody, for some reason, it seems like at some point, if you're going to spend billions of dollars, you want to find out the truth, and you're not just going to look at some promotional video. I don't know. I don't have an answer. Because of the damage to the THAAD systems, again, their THAAD systems being redeployed from South Korea, we're talking about that. I think they're en route now. That, first of all, shows that the Iranians really did take out those systems. But second, it seems like, at least in the minds of, these military people, these mean something. Or what is it? Is it? I'm not quite sure. Perhaps, like I've said before, when we're talking about supersonic and above ballistic missiles, they really can't do much. But for slower moving missiles, subsonic, and drones, but then drones are just so ridiculous because the cost differential is so huge. I don't really have an answer to that. It just seems like there are two realities. The videos that I see, what Ted Postel is saying on the one hand, and what everybody else is saying on the other hand. I think the only place where it really is effective, and we can see that, in both Ukraine and Iran, is as a defense against manned aircraft. That really does work against that, and Ted Postel says that, and that's why the Russians have, even though Ukraine's air defense has been severely degraded, they just don't have a coverage, but they still have some systems out there, and so the Russians have to be cautious. In general, their manned aircraft do not fly in Ukrainian airspace.
I guess maybe part of it is just this idea of the U.S. being defenseless, especially for these regions. I mean, this is the reason that these Gulf states were supposedly the reason that they hosted these U.S. bases, is that, oh, well, the U.S. can protect you. They got the Patriot system, the THAAD, you're invulnerable. We got this Iron Shield. So they have to pretend that they at least have some capacity to do it. But anybody with a third grade level of education can just look at this and just say, well, even if they did work, just mathematically, this doesn't make sense. It's not an investment. Just like you said, saturation tax with drones. These PAC-3s cost like $3 to $4 million. The THAADs, I think, are like 6, 7, 8 million at that.
Oh, I think it's more than that. I think it's
12 million, was it?
Maybe, yeah, it's well over 10 million. It's somewhere around 15 million. It's really extra. Maybe 13 million, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, and it just right there, we just know that this is silly. We know that Iran can produce just hundreds of missiles a month. I think I need to double check it. So I saw somewhere where the Chinese were saying, it's 100 or 300 a day. Basically, they can create an infinite amount. Their productive capacity is there. Ours is not. Like we said, you talked about the stockpiles. That's what's worrying the U.S. It's like, oh, we had this huge stockpile. It's going down. They can't keep making it. Iran, it's just this assembly line. It's like they can just keep on making these drones and ballistic missiles all day. So we know that the math doesn't add up. And then you look at what happened with 4th THAAD systems were destroyed, or 4th THAAD radars. Is that right? That were destroyed in the Gulf?
Yeah, that's something that I heard that's the case.
And so now we're moving the one from South Korea, which has caused a huge uproar in South Korea, because South Korea suffered horribly by having the U.S. insist they put this thing in here to counter North Korea, but really it was going 2,000 kilometers into China. The radar was, and so the Chinese were very upset, and they punished South Korea for letting that happen.
Right.
And now they're removing it. And it just makes you go to show as well, like this one THAAD interceptor in South Korea that caused this whole thing. And South Korea gave up its sovereignty and lost billions and billions of dollars in economic damage because of the relationship with China. It wouldn't have done anything anyways. This thing was pointless. You just have one there. We saw Iran take out 4 in the first week, and now they're going to strip the one away from Asia. So it just shows you that this thing is just worthless. But when you have a system that probably tens, hundreds of billions of dollars have gone into this program, you can't just lie and say, well, I'm sorry, it doesn't really work. It doesn't make sense. So I think it's this bureaucratic inertia. And we see how the U.S. operates. We see how the Ukrainians operate as well. It's about the PR. We're fighting the PR war. And I feel like so much of what the U.S. is doing, we can see what the White House says. Like, why did we blow up that unarmed Iranian vessel? I think it's because it would look good on social media. They can make a highlight reel. Why do they drop a bomb on this, this civilian, infrastructure or something? It makes a good highlight reel.
Right.
That's what we're doing.
Right. Yeah. Before I get to the other points, I'll just comment on what you said at the end about the, a good highlight video. That was a leak that came from the Pentagon. It said a decision to shoot down the frigate off the coast of the Iranian frigate off the coast of Sri Lanka was done for just that reason. There was no need to. They could have actually seized the vessel, and it would have been worth more to them that way. They decided that it would just look good on TV. That's a leak that I saw. I can't remember the publication in which it appeared. That was, better than a week ago.
Well, I believe it. It makes sense.
Yeah, I do too. Unfortunately. But yeah, going back to just the air defense systems, this is a point that we made, I think, quite a while ago, that actually air defense systems are kind of the linchpin of the U.S. alliance system is because, as you're saying, that's the deal. You join us, you come in on our side, right? You align your foreign policy with us, and you let us build a base in your country, and we will protect you. And we have this wonderful, very advanced, air defense system that will protect you. Um, and so it's this air defense is particularly important. It has a real political importance, a geopolitical importance. It is part of what holds together the U.S. alliance. It is the kind of the literal embodiment of the U.S. security guarantee. It's not just something we said, we're giving you the missiles, those will make you secure, right? And then people find out that it's not working, and there's a lot of anger. It's not the first time it happened. Actually, there was real complaints from the Saudi Arabians during their war, their nearly genocidal war against Yemen that went on through the 2010s. They complained. They said this is not helping us, and so that preceded this. The recent conflicts. It's quite extraordinary. Maybe I'll just make one comment on the THAADs. Now, Ted Postal said he's not sure, he has, because he can see the videos of the Patriots coming in, and he can see, he can actually count the number of interceptors that go up and the number of actual intercepts, which is very, very small, he says. And, I think he must be right. But he said with the THAADs, because those interceptions are supposed to occur they do occur at a high altitude. It's a high altitude system. That's exactly what a THAAD is, right? And so you don't have videos of it. So he doesn't have the data on that, but he suspects it's not much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, this is just on the military front. The balance is not in our favor. But the bigger thing as well is just this Strait of Hormuz. And this is the most obvious one. My 4-year-old could look at a map and I could explain to him how easy Iran could bring the world to its knees. Like, oh, all the world's energy, the thing that makes everything go round and around and moves, a huge percentage of it, not just oil, natural gas, also I think fertilizer as well. Everything just comes out of right up here, and there's this tiny little strait it can cross through, and it's so easy to understand that Iran can close this and just bring the world to its knees. Right. And this is just one of the things I just can't wrap my head around. That I don't think. How did we not think through this? Because we've been talking about the Strait of Hormuz, right, that this was Iran's nuclear option, and they did it immediately. And the U.S. didn't have a plan. It's like we knew this would happen. And so what's going to happen right now is, especially the world is already pissed at the United States because Trump has been going around tariffing the world, being very aggressive with his policies and threatening to invade Greenland and kidnapping Maduro. It's just he's been acting rogue already. And then he goes and does this. Think about all of our allies, people that we were working so hard to bring back in the fold after all the tariff destruction and damage. Countries like India, Japan, South Korea, they rely on most of their energy coming from here. And now Iran has shut it, and the U.S. has no ability to reopen this. So what does that mean? What's going to happen probably, I imagine the Iranians will do, it's like, if you want your oil, if you want to survive and not have your economy implode, you talk to us directly, you negotiate with us. And then what is going to be the terms for that? It's like, you want your energy back, Japan, Korea, say no to U.S. bases, kick out the United States, end your relationships with this. And I think they would do it. Well, I mean, what else can we do? What else can they do? And I think they're upset at the United States. I think they'd be like, you know what? The writing's on the wall for America. We understand the American empire is over and nobody wants to be part of it now because, like we just said, their protection doesn't mean diddly squat. We've seen what their protection has done in the Middle East. Why do we think that Taiwan will be safe or South Korea will be safe? It's like, no, the U.S. will use you to start a war. You will get chewed up and then they will abandon you. That's what we've seen. We've seen it again and again everywhere. And so I just don't understand. This miscalculation is just monumental for the United States. It's just monumental. And I don't know, do you see this how these countries, how Iran might play the Strait of Hormuz card? How do you see that playing?
Okay, well, I'll get to that first. just address something you said at the beginning. And that was on the other things that are exported through the Strait of Hormuz. There are a lot of very, very valuable commodities, oil and natural gas. Yes, of course. And that's anywhere, depends on how you measure, 20 to 25%, of, I've heard up to 25% of internationally traded oil and natural gas. But then there's also fertilizer. It's actually the main ingredients for fertilizer, urea and ammonia. I think urea, something like it's over 30% of the world's urea goes through that because it's a byproduct, I think, of actually natural gas. And then ammonia, again, that's something like 20% of the world's ammonia that too, is necessary for fertilizer. And then another one you didn't mention was helium, which I just heard about the other day. Yesterday I was reading about it. It's better than 30% of the world's helium. And, something we don't think about, but apparently it's very, very important for certain high-tech kinds of high-tech production. And so it's a very serious matter. The alarm bells have to be going off all around the world right now. Now, what they're obviously the Iranians are putting this pressure on, and they are putting pressure on. This is a pressure point. It is like it's like they've got their fingers on a jugular vein, and they're pressing harder and harder, and their opponent, or the whole world, is in danger of fainting. To extend the metaphor. And the hope is that this will become, especially in the case of America, right? Because that they know that there isn't the support for this war in America, and Americans are very sensitive to energy prices. And when they start to see, and we're seeing it already again, this could force Trump's hand, and he may pull out of it. Now, I know they put out these demands, like close down the bases, reparations, and the truth is they're just demands. I agree, but I just can't see the U.S. agreeing to those things. They're just not going to. Now, what does that mean? I'm not sure. I can see Trump just deciding, like we've said many times before, declaring victory and going home. You just say, we did it. This was incredible, whatever, but how will, he will not meet the Iranians' demands. Now, what will the Iranians do in that case? Will they just keep on, continue to shut down the Strait of Hormuz? Will they continue to hit bases? Will they hit, refineries? And in that case, what does the U.S. do? Does the U.S. come back in? I don't know. It's pretty messy. I don't have an answer to that. I just can't see the U.S. actually acceding to the demands.
Well, the U.S. is going to be kicked out of the region, at some point, and whether we do it. I mean, like, what are our troops even doing there? We had like 40, 50,000 people. Are they just? Well, I mean, they can't all be supporting the Air Force, right? I mean,
well, they might be. I mean, these are large. Some of these, like the Al Udeid in particular, are very large bases. And then the Fifth Fleet base, the naval base in Bahrain, is very large. So it may be.
I'm sure. I know it is, but I still think that a lot of these troops don't need to be there to this number of troops. And I think that many of them are just kind of in hiding around in the Middle East right now. We need to get those boys out, right? I mean, we need to get them home before they get killed.
Yeah.
When we need to remove ourselves from here, but they're all just cannon fodder right now. And I don't see how this ends with the U.S. still having a military presence in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, again, it's obviously this has damaged the U.S. greatly. But this is the scary thing, is that I'm sure there are many within the administration that understand that. And there's two things they can do. It's just like, okay, let's not pursue a sunk cost fallacy here. We've gone into this. We've expended a lot. We've paid we're paying a very high price, not just in terms of our own military munitions, but our reputation, et cetera. Let's not keep on going down this road. We just got to get out of here. Okay, admit that we made a mistake. And I'm sure there are certain realists, and according to some reports that have come out, like in the Wall Street Journal, that's what some of Trump's advisors are telling him. But then I was just reading yesterday, Axios was saying that just the opposite. It's just like everybody, yeah, Trump's in this, we're supporting him. He knows what he's doing. Because there's that sense it's like, oh my God, we can't suffer this kind of damage to our reputation. We're the world hegemon. Everybody has to be scared of us. Everything will unravel if we don't do this, for the reasons that you gave earlier. I think that there's a real fear of that. So there will be this real push to double down. Again, it puts us in a very, very scary situation.
Yeah, well, so when we double down, we'll suffer more losses. We will still get kicked out of the region. It's just that the nuclear threshold just starts to come closer and closer as the US and Israel run out of options to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is going to be the biggest pressure point for the United States. And if we can't reopen that Strait of Hormuz, then we lose the world.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's always a possibility that other powers would come in and say, we got to open this. But again, it's not easy to do. The U.S. Navy can't do it. The U.S. has by far the largest, well, in terms of tonnage, it's the largest Navy in the world. And they can't do it. Now, I want to point out something because it's just a ridiculous statement that Trump has made on more than one occasion. I think he said it again yesterday. It was just that he urged he says the ships, I think he meant like the captain of the ship, just be brave, show some courage and go through. His own Navy won't go in there. What is he doing? What's he talking about?
Yeah,
this is just beyond absurd, and very irresponsible. His own Navy won't go in there. So it becomes apparent that I don't think they can stop him. Which the Iranians have they have that entire coastline. And we've talked about it, in addition to the missiles and the drones. And again, you can use different types of drones. I was just reading this morning that like one of them, there was a THAAD tanker that was hit. And apparently it was hit by like a mid-range ballistic missile, which is hard to do. It came in from the top because it's a moving target. Again, ships are not so easy. You kind of, from a distance, they're not easy to hit. Close up, they're very easy to hit. But from a distance, they're not because they're a moving target. You can't just feed in coordinates and then hope, you're going to hit it. But they have mid-range and short range and drones. And then they have they have the mines. There's rumors that they've started mining straight. I don't think there's any basis to that, to be honest. And then they have this, we've heard about how their Navy has suffered. But I remember reading like years and years ago that they built up a really large fleet of smaller speedboats, which they can hide. And they have them. They have them hidden in caves, it's just that along the coast. And there are probably thousands of those. And those can go out, not only can they lay mines, but they can also, fire at ships. It just, it's virtually impossible to prevent them from keeping that strait shut. In other words, it's virtually impossible to forcibly open that strait when the Iranians say no. Yeah, we're in a real bind here, and it's looking pretty bad. Now, one thing you're talking about the support of the world, I think, this is going to further damage the U.S. No question about it. In the end, I think people know what's going on. But officially, we don't have very many countries really speaking clearly about what's going on. We had a vote in the UN Security Council, the 15 members, the expanded, not the permanent members. And it was condemning Iran for its attacks on the Gulf states, which ridiculously is described as unprovoked. You might have some kind of position if you're saying, like, don't hit any civilian targets or anything other than U.S. bases. But clearly the Iran has a right to strike military bases there. There's no question about that, just under, the laws of war. They have under the UN, there's a UN articles. There's one of them that actually gives some, a right to that. If you're attacked, you have the right to attack the military of the other side. And so, anyway, this was a ridiculous resolution that was put before the UN Security Council, and it passed 13-0. 2 countries abstained, Russia and China. All the rest, and you look at them, okay, many of them you see are U.S. vassals or, of course, U.S., Germany, the other European countries. Pakistan has kind of become sort of iffy for the U.S., but they have a government in there that they're pleased with. I think they engineered a coup. They got rid of Khan, who was showing real independence. So anyway, a lot of them are vassals, but not all of them. Like Colombia, I'm surprised, were voted for this. And the Russians said they actually put forward another resolution, which was very reasonable ahead of time, but that was rejected. It wasn't considered. And the Russians said that this was, ridiculous. Describe it as unprovoked. This was just, as the Russians put it, it inverted reality. But they didn't vote against it, which I think is a shame. I think, again, it's just this caution. They knew it was wrong, and they said it was wrong, but they're always careful. They want to maintain relations with as many countries as possible. They have important relations with these Gulf states, and so they abstained. But again, 13-0, it shows that the U.S. still, at the official level anyway, the U.S. still has a lot of control. Western hegemony is still quite powerful. We've seen that ebb, like in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war. The initial votes condemning Russia were overwhelming, but they have declined steadily from year to year. And we'll probably see that in the case of this war, too. The U.S., at least nominally, still does have this very large alliance, or not exactly an alliance, but just sort of a network of friendly, you could call them, countries, or maybe you want to say more realistic, subordinate countries throughout the world. But that, again, I just had the sense that behind the doors, they're going to say, like, what the heck were these guys doing? And that has to hurt. Again, it's just like, it's hard to get these institutions to really change policy. These things get set kind of over the course of decades, and to really change policy and shift alliances, that's very difficult for a government or an institution. We've already seen, real shifts. We've talked about it earlier, especially in relation to the Ukraine war. So it's happening. It will continue to happen, but it'll be slow.
Well, don't you think what I said earlier about how Iran will play the Strait of Hormuz card is that they will have, because like you said, these countries, nobody can forcibly have Iran open up the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody can get their navy in there and do it. This is Persia. They have control of that strait. So then what does that mean? The pressure has to be put on the United States. People say, this is your fault, Israel and the United States. You started this war. You did this. We all knew that this would happen. This is why you don't attack Iran. This is why you shouldn't have done that. Right. And so won't the Iran be able to essentially have a lot more leverage now with the world and say, like, look, we don't want to hurt your economy. But you have to understand that we are fighting an existential battle that would, a war of aggression started by the U.S. and Israel. They attacked us twice during negotiations. Like the Russian says, they are inverting reality here. So if you want to, we want to supply the world with their energy. But obviously, we're in a very difficult situation right now. So if you want to help us out and get the oil flowing and the fertilizer flowing, want the world economy to get going, cut your ties with the United States, kick out their bases. That's the way I see it going, right? Like you said, Iran should be able to allow selective passage of vessels. I think they will have that ability, right? And then I've been hearing, I don't know if this is true. It's hard to know that there's still oil going to China, for example, that Iran is allowing that. And then I hear other people say it's completely shut off. I don't know what's going on. But I imagine as this goes on, there will be some type of system that they'll put in place to allow nations that are friendly to Iran and are denouncing the U.S. aggression, U.S. Israeli aggression, will be given passage. And this will just be further isolationism, for the United States.
Yeah. On the issue of the oil, Iranian oil going to China. I've heard that too, that their ships have gone, and in fact, their oil exports have increased. I have a lot of trouble believing that. I really do. Because, look, the U.S. hasn't hesitated to grab, let's say, tankers out in the Indian Ocean. This is prior to the war. Up in the North Atlantic, a Russian flagged tanker in the North Atlantic, a Chinese linked tanker in the Indian Ocean. Would they really just let the Iranians, and they got all this huge fleet right there in the Arabian Sea, would they just let an Iranian tanker steam through? I just can't see it. I just can't see it. So I've heard that, but I just don't believe it. And I know
Well,
that at least one Iranian tanker was blown up. Um, if
what about
if it's happening, then it would have to be because of Chinese influence somehow. The Chinese say, if you don't let our tankers through, no more rare earths, no more a number of other things, or something like that. So let's, right now I have my doubts about it, but if it's happening, then there's some other story behind it that we need to clarify.
Well, I mean, what about if the Chinese Navy got involved to protect, the friendly vessels, that to counter the U.S. Attempts to maybe seize Iranian tankers or any tankers that are shipping oil to,
Yeah,
Iranian
that's an
friendly
interesting
countries?
question. I guess that's the sort of thing that could happen. I mean, at some point,
At some point, I mean,
it's China has prepared for this war. So they're unlike the Europeans who are just total idiots and just live in this ideological la la land, especially when it comes to energy. The Chinese are hard headed. They could see something like this could happen. They understood, what would the effects of a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And so they have been building up their reserves. They've been building up, alternative energy sources. So they have, very extensive nuclear uh, power plant system, many nuclear power plants and other alternative energies like wind and solar, which accounts for, I don't think it's a large percentage, but it does increase their, domestic production of electricity. And then they have Russia, and Russia would be happy to, just send them oil all day long. Um, and give them first dibs on it. I'm sure they'll probably have to pay a higher price, but they'll be happy to do it. So the Chinese aren't really under that much pressure, but they, it does affect them in the long run. Um, the Indians and the Europeans are the ones that are probably hurting the most. Japan's highly dependent, but they did prepare for it, as we said. I think they're already starting to release some things from their reserves, which are good for 8
yeah.
months. So they could actually last out. If you start to get to 8 months, then there's going to be panic, or close to 8 months. There will be real panic in Japan. But they're not panicking yet. I think it's Europe and India, because India was highly reliant on Iranian oil. And then we got the statement that it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to give this exemption to India. We're going to let them buy this Russian oil, that's actually already seaborne and for 30 days. And as interestingly, the Indians later came out and said, this is nonsense. We're not asking anybody for permission. We didn't agree to your permission. We're just going to buy it, which is interesting. Now, because there's a lot of question about what really happened. The U.S., some months ago declared that India had agreed to stop buying Russian oil. And actually, the Indians were being very coy about it. They weren't saying anything for a long time. And then there was clear that, especially after the sanctions on Lukoil and what is it, Rosneft, or I think I said that, Rosneft or whatever, forgive me, whatever. The two Russian oil companies, they did reduce their consumption. There was a significant, not a huge degree, but there was a decrease. And I think maybe they were just going to let it go down for a while and go back up. They're just kind of playing a game with Trump. They understood. In fact, I was just reading a statement from an ex-Indian diplomat, is that we understand the kind of person that Trump is, and he doesn't like to be challenged directly. You don't want to in any way, suggest that he isn't brilliant and in total control of the situation. So you just don't say anything. Anyway, they did, I think they did kind of maybe partially cave in, but this was a bridge too far. And the statement that, oh, we've granted the permission, they went out and said it for the first time, which is kind of unlike the Indians, in their relationship with the U.S. So it shows that they are starting to lose patience. with the U.S. there. What they'll do is unclear. Again, Modi, unfortunately in India, there are a lot of people, including Modi himself, that see Israel as an ally. I think that's partly, he's the leader of a Hindu nationalist party, and there is a lot of, anti-Muslim feeling among Hindus. I don't know the extent of it. I don't know India very well, but I know that it exists. There's a fair amount of anti-Muslim feeling with India, and we know the history there. There was a great civil war that ended up leading to the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh. It wasn't Bangladesh immediately, but we don't have to go through the whole history. So, but at the same time, India's had good relations with Iran. We'll see, over time what they do. India could be very important in all of this.
Yeah. We often talk about the three pillars that support American hegemony, the economic and the military, and we kind of address two of those. We're losing on the military front. We just talk about the inability to produce weapons and really the right weapons for this war, and our lack of air defense, and how these bases have been damaged and the U.S. military reputation has been shattered. The idea of that if you have American military bases, you are protected. Clearly not true. And then the economic one has been huge. We talk about the Strait of Hormuz, how they just can really bring the world to its knees. Iran can't by closing this, and that's what they're doing. And so that is just going to shatter and turn, I think, everybody against the United States. But then the big one we haven't talked about much is so much the soft power, the moral position. And we understand Iran is fighting for its existence. They totally get it. They were attacked during negotiations multiple times. And I think what we see is many people around the world rooting for Iran because they see Iran as not just fighting for their own existence, but fighting on behalf of much of the world. The freedom, including here, I think a lot of people, and this is the way that I look at it, fighting for the freedom from American hegemony, freedom from Zionist control. And the mask has fallen. We see that our country, our institutions have been taken over by these evil entities, primarily Zionism. And at least in this, when we're talking about here, Ukraine and other things, we can talk.
Right.
Yeah, we can talk about other things, but it's intertwined. And so, at least I'm viewing it as a liberation that Iran. And so, and this is why I think many Americans are in a tough spot because I don't want these are Americans. These are people in my country that are dying over there in the Middle East, that are over there killing the Iranians. I hate it all. I don't want Americans to die, and I don't want Iranians to die. And it's just awful that this is happening. But I know who the good guys are. I know who the bad guys are, and my country is not the good guy here. We're so clearly the bad guy in this situation. And so it just puts the soft power is gone. I think the world is rooting for Iran. And I don't want to say it because I like that, because I don't want to say that I'm like hoping that they kill Americans. I just want Americans to go home and take care of their own country. I don't want our soldiers to die, and I don't want them to kill Iranians. So I think many people are in my situation, in my position here in this country, and I think around the world, we see Iran as kind of fighting on behalf of all of us. Is that the right way to be looking at it?
Well, yeah, I think to a great extent. I don't know what the actual percentages are, but I like worldwide, again, the only country that I think where you have majority support for this war is Israel itself. And it's not even America. So that's quite extraordinary right there. That tells you a lot. Within America, for the first time, and I saw this, I was reading a long article this morning on Haaretz, you have a number of opinion leaders on on the right side of the spectrum coming out very strongly against this war and pointing their fingers at Israel. And we know Tucker Carlson and there's Candace Owens, there's but there's others. Why can't the names escape me now? But they're quite a few. Oh, Matt Walsh, that's another
Yeah,
one.
even
And
right. Part of
yeah,
the
so
Daily Wire, they're losing the people
right, even the
closest
Daily.
to.
Right. So I
Right.
mean, these are all major figures, and I'm excuse me for forgetting some of their names, but there's a pretty long list, or the number 5, major leaders. I don't think the article even mentioned Candace Owens, but there are a number of others who come out. Steve Bannon is one, but these people together have a very large following. Millions and millions and millions. It's and they really rival or maybe actually surpass together. I think probably easily surpass Fox News. And they're saying this right at the start of the war, and they're just completely right. It's not like this is they're cranks with this conspiracy theory. They're just they don't have to be brilliant to say this or have some secret source of information. It's just plain to see. And then on the other side, even the establishment is admitting to a great extent, that, Israel pressured Trump into this. And of course, this doesn't absolve Trump of responsibility. He foolishly went along with it. So even within the U.S., there's a real question mark. And I think, again, the U.S., we've always talked about the wars. The whole world can think all kinds of things. In the end, Israel doesn't give a damn. They know they've lost the world, but they can't lose the U.S. And that's a danger. So, again, that's why, that article appeared in Haaretz. It said, this is somewhat alarming. This is something that we should worry about.
Yeah. I mean, Marco Rubio just straight up said that Israel forced our hand. So it's not, it's right from the belly of the beast itself. Is
you're right.
Yeah. And, just that we can see that Western politicians, they can't condemn Israel and the United States, like how quick they were to condemn Russia and expel it from all these international bodies and jump on this. And we watch Israel execute a genocide live streamed to us for over 10 years, do these 2 unattacked.
Well, not 10 years, 2 years.
Oh, sorry. Did I say 10 or 2 years? Yeah. And then just, just everything they've done to Iran, the assassinations, and then sneak attacks during negotiations. After all this, and then these countries still cannot condemn this clear and obvious illegal aggressive attack that was carried out. Right. This illegal action the European countries still can't get themselves to do it. It just shows the world. It shows the everyday person like me or you, anybody living in Europe, that, hey, we do have a problem here. Our countries are controlled. This isn't some crazy conspiracy anymore. This is just out in the open. The mask has fallen. And then that's why I was saying that many people are seeing this like, hey, Iran is fighting the Epstein class. That's what this is. And Iran understands that too. They're leaning into it. And this is something that I think the US and Israel had never imagined, that somehow the evil mullahs, the Ayatollah, this evil Islamic regime would be able to win the PR war. But but they just don't understand it's on the backdrop of a genocide that we all watched, and on the backdrop of all these blatant acts of aggression against Iran, all these lies. And we understand now, world, like I said, the mask has fallen. And so that's the real nail in the coffin for the Zionists, for this project. So we talked about just the economic, military, soft power. It's gone, kaput.
Yeah, right. Well, it's amazing. Yeah, no, I'm just stunned by the, it's, I don't know what it is sometimes, if it's just plain old, if stupidity or fear or just to kind of, I don't know what it is, that explains the statements, the attitudes, the positions that Western leaders, especially European leaders, have taken. Just to give you one example is Macron. I think soon after the war broke out, the attack on Iran, occurred. Macron said he called on the Iranians to now conduct negotiations in good faith. I just don't. When I heard that, I laughed. I heard somebody else read it on a podcast, and people just laughed. Anybody who knows anything, it's just such an inversion of reality again, right. And it's just not going to work in the long run. Um, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, did you see that like that woman in Australia? She just was wearing had a shirt that said "From the river to the sea,"
yeah,
and she's now what 2 years in prison for that. I believe that's right, and at least that's what I've been seeing on X. But it just shows that this is what I'm saying about
right.
we know who controls us. If
Yeah,
you can't wear if you can go to jail for wearing a shirt like that,
right,
but watching somebody execute a genocide for over 2 years, nobody does anything about it, then
right.
we know that there's a serious problem here,
Yeah,
and we
yeah,
know who's controlling us and who these people are, and it's just crazy to think that this is Australia all the way over on the other side of the world, and we
yeah,
have Western Europe just this Zionist
yeah,
control is real. That's what
yeah,
that is. And I don't think we should skirt around and pretend and be afraid to call it out.
yeah.
We
You're
have to
right.
say it.
Right.
It's just,
Yeah, this credibility gap, and the credibility gap continues to widen. It's turning into a yawning abyss. And the way the authorities are dealing with it, rather than adjusting their policies, or, in the end, they seem to be incapable. Well, they are incapable of justifying what they're doing. Right. It's just because it's so blatant. So they're resorting increasingly to just outright, force crackdowns. And we see it, across the Western world. But you take that route, I think it's an admission, or I take it as a sign that their days are numbered. That's just not going to work it may have an effect in the short run. It's not going to succeed in the long run. They're going to lose.
yeah. Well, one last thing I want to talk to you about, like as they become increasingly desperate, we're going to see more and more actions that are a little more and more insane. And I mean, one of them is is the false flag. We know that Israel has a history of false flags, but the problem is everybody is very aware of it. And I'm sure you saw these news articles and all these little clips about that Iran is preparing for a drone attack on California. Have you seen that, right?
Yeah,
These
no,
are
I've
real.
heard
These
of.
are real
Yeah,
articles. These are real news clips.
yeah.
And then there was this. There was this story about drones being stolen from Fort Campbell, or I forget what fort it was.
Uh-huh.
And they're giving a $5,000 reward for anybody that can find information about it. First of all, $5,000. That's what you really. That's how much you care about this. That in itself is just odd, right? Why would you always?
Yeah.
I mean, again, it doesn't make any sense. And so I just wonder, would they be stupid enough to try a false flag when everybody is just completely on to them right now? That they're not going to get away with the false flag. Like, are they going to try to take down some building in Los Angeles? A lot of people are saying Larry Silverstein, he just purchased like the U.S. Bank Tower in Los Angeles, and people are saying, yeah, don't go to work on that one because he was the one that didn't show up to work famously on 9/11, and I believe he was the one that took like the special insurance policy out for if it gets hit by planes or something like this, right? I don't remember the whole story behind it. But anyways, do you think that this false flag thing is a legitimate concern?
It's a legitimate concern, sure. Especially if, like we're saying, it becomes increasingly apparent to both Israel and the U.S. that they really don't, that they have miscalculated. And we're already hearing a lot of reports in both the Israeli and the U.S. media to that effect. And as that concern becomes a real anxiety and then turns into a panic, they're going to start flailing. And, they say, well, we can't back out because then that would be an admission that this was a total disaster. And that would be an even greater disaster, right? So we got to do something. We got to get the people back on our sides. And yeah, sure, they could. That's certainly possible. I think there already have been false flags. Some of these, like the drone going into Azerbaijan, a missile going into Turkey, and the Iranians say they are. There's just no reason in the world. It's always a possibility that some drone went off course or whatever, but there were a number that occurred within a very short period of time, or an attack on in Saudi Arabia on civilian infrastructure there, and the Iranians said we had nothing to do with that. Again, I think they probably already have been false flags, and they've failed so far, but they could go for a big one. It's just like if they see if they sense that they're actually losing the American public, both the Israelis will really panic about that, and so will Trump. And I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but I think that's believable that they could go that far. I mean,
Do you think
this is a
it would
very
be
reckless
effective?
administration, and again, the Israelis have a long track record of doing that kind of thing.
Do you think that it would be effective this time around, though, if they carry out another false flag?
Well, they would have to do a very good job of it. There would be a great deal of suspicion. I think in the past there wouldn't have been. I think that there was tremendous trust in the U.S. government. There has been, and there's still too much trust. There are a number of people. I don't know if it's a majority anymore, but there are many people who are just going to believe what the U.S. says, and they have this. They don't doubt, Iranian perfidy. They really are the most terrible people in the world or something. There are people like that, and they'll go for it. But um, this is a different America now. There will be a lot of skeptics from day one, I'm sure, including, those names that I mentioned on the right, but on the left as well. There's going to be certainly on the left as well, there will be a lot of skeptics, and it may not succeed. It probably won't, I'll just say.
Yeah, I don't think it will. I mean, a lot of these, prominent conservative commentators like Candace Owens is just straight up saying that Israel was behind 9/11, and Tucker is strongly insinuating that the Israeli involvement was high.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so already there is this a big questioning about 9/11, and so I think this is I just don't see them getting away with it, doing something like this again. I just don't. The American people, I don't think will accept it. I hope we don't, and I hope it doesn't. Of course, I hope it doesn't happen. It's just so
Yeah.
crazy to think that that's what I'm worried about, like an attack from our so-called greatest ally, the one that if you criticize, the Australians will throw you in jail for years, or you'll get thrown in prison in the UK for saying Palestine action now, something like this. This is
Mm-hmm.
insane.
Right.
This is yeah, this is just going to be a fascinating battle that's going to be played out on just so many different levels. Because, like I said, I view this kind of as Iran. It's fighting for its existence, but it's also fighting for the liberation of the Western world, of all of us that have been living in American hegemony and didn't understand what it was and what was happening and what was going on. Now we understand, and it needs to end. It needs to end now. And the U.S. is just, we're just in so much trouble. I just can't believe how things have been bad already. Prior to the war breaking out, prior to the Ukraine war, we were in a bad situation. Just the amount of debt that we spent, spending over $8 trillion on the Iraq war. We're in a difficult situation economically. And then just to throw all this on top of it, the American people will explode, and for a good reason. It's coming tax season. It's so hard to just afford rent and groceries here, and it's going to get a lot worse. And then we're going to have to pay a ton of taxes in a country where we get no health care or no free education, and send over a huge portion of our paycheck to Netanyahu so he can continue to slaughter kids in Gaza and invade Lebanon and bomb schools in Iran. No, the American people have had enough. I don't think that I don't see this continuing much longer, more than a couple of months, before we see some real heavy downstream effects that are going to cause people on the streets. I mean, we need to impeach Trump. We need to pull out, right? That's what we got to hope for, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That would be
How
one
is
of
that?
the better options, if not the best one.
Right. That to me, that seems like the best option now. But I mean, if we impeach him, then
We have
I mean,
Vance.
what then we got Vance, and then does the same thing, and people. It's
I
just like,
just
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
Vance might not. I don't.
I don't know.
Who
I've been
knows?
pretty
He might.
disappointed
He
in him.
might have the sense to pull out of it. I think that he might certainly see the way the wind is blowing, and realize that it is very unpopular. Right now, the truth is that Trump still has a tremendous amount of power within the Republican Party. He's done these very stupid things, and he's been criticized by, again, these opinion leaders, and that does hurt him. But he still has a significant following, and he still is able to, use his following to, keep the Republicans in line so far. He's going after um, Thomas Massey with he's pulling out all the stops. I think he actually went there and gave some, led a rally against Thomas Massey and described him as like the worst guy in history or whatever, with his using his typical superlatives and typical nonsense. And that's another test right there is if Thomas Massey wins in spite of that, in spite of Trump and his people pulling out all the stops, of course that's, I don't know when the primary is, but that would be, a very significant event. That's something to look at. Let's hope that they're by that time that people have woken up. Let's hope, that the MAGA base actually, there's part of it that will never turn on Trump, but that a significant part of it will. That's what we need.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's hope and see. I mean, the whole, what scares me is, the State of the Union address that Trump gave, the one part of the speech where both the Republicans and Democrats stood up to applaud is when he talked about bombing Iran. So that just shows you that it's our whole rotten system. Right. So we got to get all of these guys out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I know that there is some sort of group and, it's on the left that is trying to say that we have to get rid of our leaders. They let us down on this, let this war happen. They're going after both the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, right, and then Chuck Schumer in the Senate, because both of them, responsible. Now, some of them, what you're finding with the Democrats is, they applauded beforehand, or they were quiet, or they voiced these gentle criticisms. Now that they see that it's going wrong, they're starting to speak more strongly when they realize, hey, wait a second, this is
so political opportunists.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, sometimes opportunism works to our advantage, but we want eventually like to get people who are actually committed to true, truly to the interests of the American people. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah, it's not too much to ask, right? Ask for a government that represents us.
Right.
But apparently it is. Okay, Dad, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
All right. Unless there's any... You seemed like you might want to say one other thing.
Okay. Well, there was one thing I just wanted to mention, just to maybe kind of tie in Ukraine, with what's going on in the Middle East. As that very recently, the Ukrainians carried out an attack on some pumping stations. I guess they were actually compressors, attached to these pumping stations for the Turkstream pipeline, which is a natural gas pipeline that goes to Turkey, from Russia, but also into Europe. So it's one of the few, again, Europe is shut itself off almost entirely to pipe gas from Russia, but this is the one that's still remaining, and the Ukrainians went after it. Now it's just it seems extraordinary because in this time when the Europeans are greatly alarmed, they realize that they're in huge trouble. Their natural gas prices have jumped by over 50% in a very short period of time. Qatar has already shut down its gas production facilities. And then even if one day the Strait of Hormuz will open, it'll take them a while to get it back online. So the Europeans are in serious difficulty. At this time, the Ukrainians go after the Turkstream. I think it's quite extraordinary. And I just wonder how the Europeans are going to respond. Are they going to be such, I don't know, masochistic idiots and say, thank you for Ukraine for doing this to us? But
Probably.
But there are at least some Europeans that are saying, hey, maybe we need to reconsider our whole policy. But it's just too little too late. Again, I could go on and on about the stupidity of the Europeans, but I wouldn't serve any purpose at this point. So we'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Sounds good, Dad. All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.